Welcome to The Lover's Hole, a Patrick O'Brien podcast. As always, you're with Mike.
And with Ian.
As we reread the Aubrey Matron canon of Patrick O'Brien. Ian, tell us, where were we last time and what do we have to look forward to today?
Well, Mike, we're edging slowly towards the end of the Lover's Hole project. We're almost out of Aubrey Matron content, but we thought this would be a great moment to look back on maybe the whole of the life of Patrick O'Brien. So we turn to somebody who's already been a great friend to O'Brien readers by bringing us titles like A Sea of Words and Harbour and High Seas. And also, of course, he became the author of the biography, Patrick O'Brien, A Life Revealed. So today, Mike, we're going to hear the interview that you and I had with author Dean King. So we're really excited to welcome to the show writer, journalist, worldwide Patrick O'Brien superfan and biographer, Dean King. Welcome. How are you?
I'm great. I'm happy to be here. Thank you.
Yeah, Dean, I think, as we often start, we'd love to know how you first came across the Patrick O'Brien Aubrey Matron series.
I was working in New York City, and that sort of iconic review came out in the New York Times. They called them the best historic novels ever written. Right. And I immediately knew that was something that was going to appeal to me. I was so busy at work at the time that I actually cut the review out of the New York Times, threw it into a drawer. And it was a couple of years later when I pulled it out again. The little publishing company I'd worked for had gone belly up. And so I had some time on my hands, and I read. There were 16 at the time. I read all 16 of them in 4 months. I could not put them down. They were so great.
Wow.
And that would have been, we're talking way back when the books were first coming out, right? This would have been before the Peter Weir movie. You're part of the original wave of the fandom. Is that fair?
Yeah, that review was 1990.
Right.
And so it was probably 92-ish when I started reading them. Right. And it got me through a dark period when I was temporarily unemployed, so and it was very inspiring.
Fantastic. And then in relatively short order, your name appears as an author on some great off-quoted Patrick O'Brien companion books. We had Harbours and High Seas, and we have A Sea of Words, both of which I have on our shelves, and both of which we keep referring to in the show. Tell us about how you got to the point of being involved in those writing projects.
Well, I read those 16 novels, as I said, in 4 months, barely picking up a dictionary because the plots were so good.
Right.
But by the end of them, I didn't want to leave them, for one thing. And also I realized, something's going on in the cross-catharpins, but I really don't know what the cross-catharpins are, and that I could have gotten a lot more, and that readers could get a lot more out of the books if they knew, what these things are. And so I decided that there needed to be a companion book. And then the next leap of faith was, why not me? Even though I really didn't know anything about square rig ships, but I was enthusiastic enough, and I figured I could find some experts to help me out. So I started, digging around. I found John Hattendorf, a naval historian here, who was willing to help, and he told me about a naval medical historian who specialized in that period. So I just started pulling that together, and I put together my pitch. I had an agent from another project that I had done, and so I showed it to her, and she said, "Yeah, I like this." She sent it out to 20 different publishers, 19 of whom said no.
Oh.
But we had one publisher who said, "Well, maybe."
Cool.
And so fortunately, Henry Holt decided to go ahead with it. It did get pitched all the way up the line to Patrick O'Brien.
Oh, wow.
We'd gone to Norton. The editor there, Starr Lawrence, had thought, this is a reasonable proposal. And these two guys that I had connected, one was the director of advanced research at the U.S. Naval War College,
wow.
Certainly had cachet. Yeah. And so he sent it over to O'Brien's editor in the UK, who sent it to O'Brien. O'Brien said, "No, I've got somebody at the National Maritime Museum who's going to do my official companion book." And at that point, I was a little discouraged, but my agent said, "Look, you put together a perfectly good proposal, a strong proposal. There's no reason why you shouldn't go ahead and do this." Yeah. And so So I again took that leap of faith and said, okay, let's do it. And then something pretty amazing happened. I had a young guy who had been working with me in my previous editing role, and he had left to go get a master's degree in philosophy at the University of Virginia.
Okay.
I called him up. I said, Greg, hey, I've got this new research intensive project. You want to help me out with it? And he was, being a hungry, starving student, he said, sure, I'd love to work on that. I give him the pitch and the concept, and he goes to the University of Virginia library. And you have to remember, this is the 1990s. They're just digitizing libraries at the time. He goes in there and starts asking questions, goes to the digital section. And honestly, I had no idea what was going on in that realm at the time. And somebody there said, look, we just digitized the entire Oxford English Dictionary.
Wow.
So if you give us all your terms, we can kick it through the OED and give you all the definitions. And so I went through the books and came up with about 3,000 terms that I thought could use some explanation and elucidation for the readers of the novels. And we did it. They kicked it through the OED, and which kicked out these long, the full OED where you get the entire history of the word.
Yeah.
So I would go through that big definition, find the maritime definition for our period, and then so I collected all those, and then I went to the New York Yacht Club Library, which has the finest, one of the finest maritime naval collections in the world, private, and they had Falconer's Dictionary of the Marine from that period.
Excellent.
So I'd take the OED dictionary definition and take Falconer's, compare them, and work through. And I think my weakness was that I'm a generalist, and my strength is that I'm a generalist. I didn't know anything about these terms, so I knew what the average reader didn't know, at least.
Yeah.
And I could go through there and really try to piece together definitions that didn't have jargon. That was one of my main goals. Was I'm not going to fill these things with words that you need to then go define again.
Right.
Which was a bit tricky and took some time, but all in all, we were able to execute this companion book in less than a year. With the team I put together, including John Hattendorf doing a big essay on the naval ships of the day, and then adding in an essay about the medicine of the day. And so it turned out to be, I think, a pretty good package. And there was all kinds of great art that I found from the period that was public domain, pulled that all in to illustrate the book as best as possible. And then OBrien had a researcher at the National Maritime Museum, and that guy worked on his book for 7 years, and never completed it, died before he could ever complete his companion book. So for a long time, this was the only companion book.
And of course, O'Brien's not having any regrets now. I suspect. I don't know. Who knows? Beyond the grave. But I'm thinking, what if he had greenlighted your companion book originally? We may have never had the biography. So
yeah, probably wouldn't have.
Right.
And then so I did that, and the book came out pretty quickly. I was still a broke writer in New York City, desperate for a job, and so I actually went down to Greensboro, North Carolina, to interview for a travel industry magazine position. Yeah. But by the time I got back to New York City, Henry Holt was calling me up saying, "Hey, this book is doing really well. Do you want to do another one?" Because I'd already sort of lofted out a couple of ideas, and so that's how Harbors and High Seas came about.
Okay.
The geographical companion book.
Right.
So it was a fun period. I ended up spending about 8 years doing the companion books, the biography, and then I did a series of books. Well, I did an anthology of firsthand accounts that OBrien used, which was really fun to piece together a naval history of that time, of those wars, through firsthand accounts. And then there's both the naval history and the quality of the writing in OBrien, and it's hard to find that anywhere else. So I set my next mission is finding any books about that period, because a lot of people have written about the age of Nelson and the great age of square rig naval warfare. But few people have done it with the skill of O'Brien. So my goal was to find the books that once you'd finished O'Brien's series were strong enough literarily to maintain your interest and continue to give you a nice slow off ramp from the O'Brien series, so you're not just jumping into the deep end with nothing there.
People ask about that so much. It's like one of the most asked internet questions by O'Brien readers. So tell us, where did you get to with that?
Yeah, it'd be fun to get that list of books, but there are a few Frederick Marriott books that are really terrific. The guys Nordhoff and Hall, who did the Mutiny on the Bounty trilogy, also wrote a book called Dr. Dogbody's Leg, which is hilarious.
Oh, great.
And I really loved. And so I sort of got to pick and choose my way through, a couple centuries of literature about the period and came up. I think we got to 10 books in the series.
Right. I read or saw somewhere there was a collection called Heart of Oak Sea Classics. Is that the same thing?
That's it. Yeah.
Nice.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
So that kind of gets us to the point where we say, how then did the Biography Project come about? Because that must have been a different proposition altogether again from doing the companion works, right?
Yeah. Because I was so, I won't say obsessed, but I was so infatuated by these books and a real O'Brien believer in that his reputation should be lasting, that he was a great novelist and not just a genre writer. And I really wanted to be a part of maintaining that reputation, helping create that lasting reputation for him. So and then he didn't want biographical material out there, which was a bit unusual. And I kept sort of gathering what I could find, the scant, bit clues that I could find. And I just thought that it would be a real shame if O'Brien in his generation passed away and we really didn't know anything about O'Brien. And he would always put out that the Homer reference and say, you don't need to know anything about Homer to appreciate the Odyssey and Iliad. But, that was a different time.
Right.
And I thought we'd really be doing a disservice if we didn't collect some of the material around the writing of these books. And I had no intention to go into any kind of salacious background or anything. That wasn't my interest. I didn't know when I started that he wasn't, exactly who he said he was.
Right.
So that wasn't the intention. And I didn't know what I'd get. I actually pitched the project to Henry Holt as In Search of Patrick O'Brien, just saying, look, I'm going to go try to find out what I can find out. And I've got these clues and I've got enough from the tribute book that was done about him to at least piece together something that people who read the series would want to read. We can collect the book reviews and put out a nice history of the publication. And so that's how I got started.
And along that journey, hearing where you started from and what your intent was, when did you realize that the actual story was a little bit different from, kind of what we'd heard?
Well, I think there were some slight hints, but a friend of mine who knew how passionate I was on the topic was actually at a dinner that O'Brien attended in Philadelphia. Actually, it was a friend of my friend. And so the word had gotten out, and the friend told my friend that O'Brien had said that he was from Ballinasloe in Ireland, in Western Ireland. And so I had that clue, really, this really third-hand clue. But it was something to go on. We had a birth date, that 1914. And so I literally, with interest from Henry Holt, but no book contract, I decided I'm going to make that leap of faith and go to Dublin and go into the records and see what I can find. And when I got there happened to be a volunteer, the late Harry McDowell, a wonderful guy who helped me out doing the research. And we got in there, and we could only find one birth record for Patrick O'Brien. And it wasn't spelled O'Brien with an A.
Mm-hmm.
It was spelled with an E, is more typical in Ballinasloe. And so in the birth date was 1913, not 1914. So I thought, well, okay, this is all we got. Maybe he anglicized the name, and maybe he's a little superstitious, so he changed it to 1914 instead of 1913. I mean, it's what else could I do? I was kind of desperate at that point. And so Harry said, okay, that's your clue. You got to go chase it down. So I had a friend who was with me helping me out, and we hopped in a car and drove out to Ballinasloe. And I get to this beautiful little village, and all I've got is the birth certificate. And what do I do now? So I saw a tea shop, and I thought, well, that's a place to start, right? The wonderful older women of the village will probably come in there, and they're the keepers of the history generally, and they'll know what's what and who's who around here. So I go in there and order tea, and just start asking some of the women around, do you know the O'Briens? And that's kind of like going into a McDonald's here and asking if you know the Smiths or Joneses, and, in the States. And they looked at me like I was kind of crazy and didn't really trust me. And who is this Yank looking for the O'Brien? And then a woman comes through the door, and one of the women who I'd asked says, oh, she'll know. She's, connected to the O'Briens. Ask her. So I went up and showed her the birth certificate, and she said, oh, yes, yeah, I've got a cousin across town who will know about this, and gave me the phone number and said, tell them, that I told you to call them. And I went to the phone booth. They had phone booths back then, and maybe they still do, but
Sure they do.
I called them up, and they said, yeah, sure, why don't you come over and show it, that birth certificate to us. They came in out of their garden in their wellies, and I drove over there, and they opened a couple beers, and we looked at the birth certificate, and the man says, oh yes, I know that Patrick O'Brien. I buried him myself. And this was a shocker to me, because Patrick O'Brien, my Patrick O'Brien, was still alive. Our Patrick O'Brien was still alive and well in the south of France writing. And so it really hit me in the face. And he said, look, I'll take you over and show you his grave if you look kind of shocked and in disbelief. So we went out into the cemetery, and he showed me the grave of that Patrick O'Brien. And at that point, I was kind of crestfallen. I thought, wow, here I am. I have no book deal. I have no idea who Patrick O'Brien is. He clearly isn't in Ireland. But I called Harry McDowell, and in desperation, really. And Harry, I got nothing after all this work we did. I don't know who he is and have no clue. And he said, oh no, my friend, now you have something.
Yeah.
He's not who he says he is. And so that was my first clue.
Wow. And from there, I mean, not to spoil everything that's in the book, because lots of folks listening won't have read the book, but there's a whole other story besides the one that appeared in his little autobiographical essay that went into the kind of fly leaves of some of the books, right?
Yeah. So Harry says, look, I've got a friend who works in the records in London, and we're going to get in touch with him,
right? And
he will go into the records and find. This is obviously, he's not Irish, so he's got to be English.
Yeah.
And he will. We can go to his marriage certificate and figure out who his father was, but also we can go into the name change documents. And that's where this researcher, who I told what I was doing and what I was interested in, went back in and found the name change document.
Right.
I think, which then led to the marriage document, which had to have O'Brien's, whose actual name at birth was Russ, surname at birth was Russ. So he went on, found the marriage certificate under the name Russ, and then O'Brien's father had to was listed on there. That's kind of cracked the nut. Yeah. Once we found his father's name, then we could go in and dig up the history, and we found the whole backstory of O'Brien, which was fascinating. How really his grandfather, either grandfather, great grandfather, was a German immigrant and furrier to the Queen, and had made a pile of money, but had I think there were 13 kids in that next generation, and so the money had been dispersed. And O'Brien's own father was a bit of a mad scientist, a doctor, mad scientist, and not a good steward of the family treasure chest. So O'Brien had grown up in relative poverty.
Yeah. Wow. Now, that uncovers all sorts of other things about O'Brien's early life, and we'll get into more of this later on, I think. But there's a couple of responses that I'd love to hear about. One response is like OBrien and Mary at some point here, we're talking about the late 1990s, aren't we, must have got wind, or were you starting to ask them if they'd contribute?
I was. I'm trying to think exactly how that all unfolded. He insisted that he didn't want a biography written.
Yeah.
I felt secure in the fact that I was doing it for the right reasons.
Yeah.
That I really just wanted to support his literary reputation.
Yeah.
And honestly, I'm not a super judgmental person.
Right.
The fact that he changed his name really in no way diminished my opinion of him.
Yeah.
And I didn't think should diminish anybody's opinion of him. The fact that he would want to create up a different persona, I've got no problem with that.
Yeah.
Even the fact later on that I would discover that he left an early marriage under difficult circumstances, certainly. I don't consider myself, the judge. Everybody's, done things they regret. Everybody matures. I'm really about who is this person? How did he create these books? And I guess in my soul, my greatest motivation was that even maybe beyond supporting his literary reputation was the relationship he created between Aubrey and Maturin, that wonderful friendship. I wanted to know what inspired it, what created it, and if it existed in real life. That was the grail for me, was did that relationship exist? And, how would it affect me? How should I be a friend? How should I have those kinds of friendships and improve my friendships with, so it really was kind of a deep philosophical thing for me in a way. And then the BBC was making a documentary about O'Brien, and they got in touch with me and asked me to come up, and I did an interview. And here I was with also Walter Cronkite had interviewed O'Brien, and I'd been in the library with him. And for me, that was a little bit Walter Cronkite, I guess, at the time. He was our great newscaster and model of integrity and truth. And, we might not be quite so naive today, but to have O'Brien posing as an Irishman up there with Cronkite started making me think, okay, I'm not feeling any guilt here. I think the truth will be known, and it will be known eventually anyway. We would look kind of like suckers if we didn't find out for another 20 years that, all this was uncovered when we had this great cult of O'Brien, but nobody even bothered to sort of figure out what was behind the scenes.
Right.
So a lot's going to unfold, but I figured out through the records, I found out that what his original name was. Then I could do a lot of research. Richard Patrick Russ, who was this guy? And I figured out that he had written books under that name. So for a couple years, I was the only one who knew, other than my agent and my editor, that Richard Patrick Russ existed and had written books. And I was going on the internet and buying books in obscure places in Ohio by this guy for $5 out of the back room. Yeah. His early books that nobody knew were connected to him.
And most or all of them are in print now under the name that people know him as, right?
Sure. Yeah. Norton, once all the news broke, we're quick to bring those books back out, and they're truly very good books.
Yeah.
Very readable books. So when as the BBC was doing this documentary, I spilled a bit that O'Brien was not Irish born, but English, and I didn't understand, being again a naive American, what a sort of bombshell that would be in England.
Ah,
And the documentarian who made that was immediately, oh my gosh, and but he was far into the project, and he was actually over here to stage a dinner, an Aubrey and Maturin style dinner
Yep.
on the HMS Rose, which would become the surprise in Master and Commander, the movie. So I got to be in the gun room there with William F. Buckley and Cronkite, and and we had a 10-course meal, which they filmed for the documentary, which was a real highlight of my career, being there, and really fun.
Yeah.
And Ken Ringle, who was a Washington Post reporter, who's the namesake of
famous review.
Yeah. And so they made the documentary, and they teased at the end that, well, maybe Patrick O'Brien's got some secrets. Maybe he's not quite who he says he is. The Daily Telegraph watched the show, heard that clue. They stuck a reporter on it, a guy named Ben Fenton, and Ben then dug into it and figured out that there was somebody in Australia, a brother in Australia, who may have provided O'Brien with his name, stuff I already knew, but that would be revealed in the Daily Telegraph. At that point, it was determined by my team that I needed to stake my claim so that it wouldn't look like I was just following on the Daily Telegraph's research. So I wrote a story for New York Magazine about Patrick O'Brien, and in a great little sort of intersection of time and interest. And at the time before that came out, I had a trip planned to go to England to do research. And while I was in England doing the research, I met with Nikolai Tolstoy, Patrick O'Brien's stepson.
Yeah.
I went to see him, and we had a great meeting. We had a wonderful conversation. Tolstoy realized, hey, you're doing this for all the right reasons, the very reasons I've mentioned, is, and he knew that I admired O'Brien's work immensely, and that I just wanted to tell his story for positive reasons, and so he told O'Brien that maybe he should talk to me.
Wow!
But I'm in England. Then my story comes out in New York Magazine, revealing that O'Brien isn't who he said he was, and that then got sent by Star Lawrence over to O'Brien. O'Brien read it. He had called me in Richmond and left a message on my phone machine, which I didn't know he had done.
Wow.
And so he gets, after doing that, he gets a story. I do all my research in England, come home, get the message, and I'm like, oh my gosh, Patrick O'Brien called me. I've got him, he wants to talk to me. And so I'm thrilled. I call the number he left, and I get a secretary in Dublin who says, Mr. O'Brien no longer wishes to talk to you.
Wow. I mean, the timing and coincidence of all of that, at a few things happening in a different order.
Yeah.
You might have got a lot more after that.
Yeah. It was kind of a crushing blow. Yeah. But I came to realize that maybe it was also a blessing in disguise.
Right.
That if we'd actually talked, I would have been under the power of his persuasion.
Right.
And maybe he would have talked me out of doing anything, or, I don't know, but I was left with a sort of carte blanche to pursue the project as I saw fit. And while I was in England, I got in touch with his son from his first marriage, and who he hadn't talked to in decades. He had two granddaughters that his son he had never spoken to. So I don't know if O'Brien even knew he had the granddaughters. I went to Wales. One of the highlights of the research was following up on a dedication on a short story from 1950 to Major Edmund Roach and the Ladies of Innisfore. And through the story and through the records, I found out that Major Roach had passed away, but his widow was still alive in Wales. And so I had called her up and talked to her, and she said, I don't remember Patrick O'Brien, but O'Brien, you could tell from his stories, had gone there and hunted foxes. And it was the oldest fox hunt in all of Wales was at this estate. And O'Brien had been there and done that. And she said, we had a great conversation. She said, well, if you're ever, over here, come see me. So when I flew over there, I called her up and said, I'm here. She said, well, come on, come out and have dinner with me. So I drove out to the estate that she still lived at because I could see it and that would help me write about it and looking for clues. And she was hard of hearing in her upper 80s, but her assistant, her I guess house keeper, was telling me stuff about the estate and about Major Roach when she was in the other room. And the big scandal on the estate was that he had been the master of the hounds of the oldest hunt in Wales. And at the end of his tenure, as he was getting older and couldn't do it anymore, and he couldn't find a new master of the hounds to continue this hunt, he became distraught. And one day he took his shotgun down from the mantle and went out and slaughtered the pack of hounds in distress over all this. So it was a big scandal of the place. And I was getting that from this housekeeper in the background. But really, I connected with his widow, Primrose, and she, at the end of the dinner, said, look, I don't know O'Brien, but I'm going to ask around for you. And I thought, well, that's very kind. And she left me with something great to take back with me, but I didn't really expect to hear from her again. But sure enough, she went out and did some sleuth work. So by the time I got back after I got back to Richmond, Virginia, I got a call from her. And she said, look, I found a guy you need to talk to. He was a young shepherd in Kreutzer Valley, a high valley out here, back right after the war, World War II, when O'Brien came out here. And he knew O'Brien very well. So this opened the door for me to a whole nother aspect of the story. That one dedication of a short story that O'Brien wrote in 1950, really led me to 2 chapters in the biography.
Yeah.
Wow. You've had so many interactions with, so many people involved in this life. And a couple of our Patreon questions were kind of about that. It's kind of a step removed. It's funny. So, 2 of them immediately come to mind. One about the people. So you talked about meeting his stepson, Nicholas Tolstoy. And one of our Patreon supporters was saying, I wonder why Tolstoy didn't, with O'Brien writing all these novels in Collier, why he didn't leave more things for the library there, why this did not become a little bit of a mecca, and wondered if you had any take on that, Dave.
Well, the manuscripts are at Lilly Library in Indiana. So I went out there and spent time with those. A lot of early material, a wonderful thing that I sort of discovered in the research as well. Some items he was trading to get first editions of Jane Austen books. Jane Austen, who he loves so much, really amazing. So he would send parts of manuscripts and a big collection of signed first editions of everything he did to this book dealer, who would then get him copies of Jane Austen. So that was kind of a neat thing. And then I think a lot of stuff was passed on to the next generation. And I haven't really pursued that, but I know that there are Nikolai's children and maybe some other nieces and nephews have a sort of controlling interest in various materials. and I can't really speak more to that because I don't know, but I do know that they're sort of active in maintaining his legacy and maybe have these materials if they exist, and I assume that they do. That there's more, and would love to see what else exists, and at some point I'm sure it will come out. I haven't been back to the house in Collioure since OBrien's death, but this conversation is making me think I need to get back down there perhaps this summer to look around now.
Yeah.
Because I really I did go down there during the research, but and I saw O'Brien right there in front of his house one day, but because he had said that he didn't want to participate in the biography, I didn't confront him. I didn't want to do anything against his wishes. I certainly didn't feel constraint that I couldn't go down and talk to sources who wanted to talk.
Yep.
But I wasn't going to confront him against his will.
Yeah. Wow. So you mentioned earlier on that one of the things that was kind of pulling you into this story was your interest in this friendship, and the whole novel series is, as you say, is like the philosophy of how can I be a good friend. Do you get any sense that there was either a friendship that he had with another person, another man, I guess, or another friendship between two other men that he'd observed that was in any way the pattern for Jack Aubrey and Stephen Maturin?
I think it was ultimately his idealized friendship, and that maybe it was more the friendship that he never had.
Yeah.
Not to say that he didn't have friendships and admirers and good friends, but I think, as might be expected, he led a very rich interior life, and was metabolizing all these sources, and including his own life, which is one of the reasons why I think the biography is important. Is
Right.
It relates a lot of what was going on in his own life to how he created the series, sometimes in startling ways, as we know. And you can ask me questions, but I don't want to give away certain parts of the plot if your audience wouldn't want that. So I think it was largely an idealized relationship. I certainly found family members who wanted to talk, who at one point might have had a relationship with O'Brien, but felt that it had been breached or that they'd been left behind, somewhat like his first family. And so, again, this is a piece of his personality. My job's not to judge him, but to relate the facts and how it might relate to the works. And I think I'm a middle child, and maybe I see all sides of a lot of issues, and I try to be understanding. I think that's the one thing maybe a biographer needs to attempt, at least, to be sympathetic to their character, to their subject. And I didn't have to work that hard. Some people would say that O'Brien was snobby. They would say all kinds of things about him, but this guy is a towering intellect, a towering talent, a brilliant guy, and that may come with some costs. And I'm certainly willing to allow him those things. Now, I think he caused some pain within the family, certainly, but again, my job there is to point it out. I talked to his son, so I could allow his son to. I'm the vessel, I'm the vehicle. His son can express those things because he's the one who owns those things.
Right.
And so, as a biographer, that's what I tried to do, was be there to pull the material together and give a sympathetic but realistic portrait of what went on, sympathetic as well to my sources. To get his son to tell me to all this, I needed to gain his trust, and I needed to own his trust and be trustworthy. So I wanted to tell his side of the story certainly as truly as O'Brien's side, and the reader can look at that and decide what they think.
For what it's worth, my read of your book is exactly that. I think you've brought all of the things to life, and I think that the openness with which you've addressed the story is great. You've reminded me of a quote. I can't remember if it's a quote that you used in your book, but there's a moment where Jack Aubrey says at some point, "No ship carries a man rated spotless Christian hero."
Yeah.
And I remember reading that first time, not knowing that back in the 90s, I read that thinking, that's a damn good line.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
came across it again on rereading the canon when I was across like the output of your book, and I'm thinking, yeah, actually, that's
Well, that was a hope for me writing the biographies, just simply to enrich the experience. And people might say, well, you don't need to. You can read these things over and over and over. But
Sure.
I think you can read it again, just as with a sea of words. You can read it the whole series a second time with all this added information about what's going on, and go, wow, new insights, new enjoyment of the series. Again, with the geographical material, you can do it with the sources of the original stories that he mined. You can have another reading with his life. I was fascinated by things that I discovered in his life that were directly in the plot, and that I think will ultimately only enrich our experience of the books. And again, I admit to reading all 16 of the books that were out at the time in 4 months without barely picking up a dictionary, and thoroughly enjoying it and being swept away. Not everybody can read that way. I think, I'm one of those readers that I can ride on the plot and I can just soak up the music of the words and sail on that. Some readers, if they don't understand something, need to know every detail. So I think, the dictionary can help them in that way. But I encourage people also to ride the plot if they want to, and not get too tied down in that. Maybe it's a second reading. These books certainly, boy, people read them over and over, and you'll see that O'Brien plants the seed of a joke and delivers on it 40 pages later. You don't pick up on that the first time,
really
but the second or third read, you're like, oh my gosh, here's the delivery of that joke he set up way back, and it's just fun, and moving.
Cool.
Dean, you talked about friendship and being a bit of your holy grail of, where could this have come from? And it's the holy grail that really gave birth to this podcast as well. And it's, I think it's the thing that we find, one of the many things, but a core one we find most endearing about this and like the heroes and their friendship, they're very human. And part of that comes out of living very human lives. But that idea of friendship brings me back to perhaps one really important one in his life as well. His wife, Mary. And I know that we're constantly speculating. A Patreon supporter had asked, how much do you think Mary helped contribute to these books?
Mm-hmm.
And anything you can say about their friendship from what you saw or what you heard or that sort of thing.
Yeah, I think Mary's clearly a real soulmate for Patrick and the person he was meant to be with.
Right.
So, however rocky and sad maybe the breakup of his first marriage was, I think there were maybe insurmountable difficulties there in that relationship. So I think there was redemption in that relationship. He was, certainly extremely loyal and loving of his wife, and they had a model relationship. Mary typed all of his manuscripts, so there's no doubt she was influential. She was the first reader and trusted. I know in my own life, all my work goes through my wife, and I love to give her credit. If I didn't have that sounding board, it would be hard to let go of things, and her insights mean the world to me. So I can't fully speak for O'Brien in that regard, but I imagine that if she said something, hey, I think you might want to work on this. He was sensitive. He didn't like to have his work edited very much, and by the time it got to his publisher, they were very careful as to what they said. Maybe a nip and tuck here, or this could be improved, or maybe you could tell us something here, but you didn't give him a lot of feedback or criticism, because honestly, these things came out so beautifully from the get-go. He deserved that kind of careful treatment. But I do think Mary was influential and had her stamp on them. It would be interesting to look at the last couple works after she died and compare and see. Of course, he was aging, and there's no real way to. It's not apples and oranges, but and I'm sure some scholar eventually will dig into that aspect of it and maybe come up with some evidence. But yeah, I think she was an important piece of it.
And there's quite a bit. I mean, I wouldn't say that we've been scholarly and kind of deeply critical in our thinking about it, but as we were reading The 100 Days and Blue at the Mizzen, some things strike you, even just thinking at a first level about what's going on and the way the characters are now evolving, and the way he kind of lets the air out of some of the tension that have been driving the story, and the way he reflects on death and relationships. It's really tender and touching, and I think you can see that. What do you think, Mike?
Oh, absolutely. I think, when we were going through this, we were so struck by there really is a significant change here. And immediately kind of went back thinking, wait a minute, let's remember where we are in his life. And we actually looked back at your biography and we thought, oh my gosh, this is it. I mean, clearly this is like, once you see it, it's everywhere. So much.
Yeah. Gives you goosebumps that, what I think you're referring to towards the end of the series is it's an amazing artistic moment, even
right.
The translation of life to art, and you can see it so clearly. And the way he does it, the impact it makes on the reader,
right,
is shocking and powerful. And boy, it was an incredible moment for me to encounter that and sort of deal with it.
Right.
Can we go back into a couple of things, just biographical curiosities? Because there's some things that have come up lately in the show and that we know our listeners are interested in. One being, for example, O'Brien's work with he describes it as having to do with intelligence. And I think you and also Nikolai Tolstoy say he seemed to have been employed in the political warfare executive in this particular kind of branch of the Foreign Office that was dealing with effectively black propaganda. And there are a few different ways that you can take that, or you can speculate about what other bits of intelligence work he might have had his hand in or been part of, or at least witnessed. It all seems still a bit shrouded in mystery. Can you say a bit more about what sources we've got on what he did and how we come to know about that?
Yeah, it remains shrouded in mystery, and but both he and Mary were linguists, and so it stands to reason that they would be recruited into this field where they were doing fantastic things. The PWE, to the point where they might alter a stamp and take Hitler's face off of it and put Himmler on there to seed discontent and suspicion that maybe Himmler was going to take over from him, kind of really creative thinking, black propaganda undermining the morale and the confidence in Vichy France, in Germany, where, and so there's a point where one person indicates that Mary actually went to France during the war as a messenger. And but again, I got it from the child of a Frenchman who had been part of that operation.
Right.
So again, it's all a little bit shrouded in mystery, and I tried to get to the original person who interacted with Mary, but never could quite get there.
Right.
So I think there's more to be seen, and maybe as these records open up, but the UK and other places are rightly very careful about the tactics and strategies they used that might be deployed again.
Yeah.
Of course, times are changing rapidly, so I'm not sure that they apply that more. But at a certain point, somebody's going to go, hey, you know what? These are kind of obsolete things, maybe. we can reveal them.
Yeah.
What one of our Patriot supporters had said, I haven't read the biography yet, but I would love to know, and maybe he said, or they said maybe it's in the book, but about any insight into the abrupt way that death is handled in the series and the repeated demise of innocence with a bright future.
Mm. Yeah, well, redemption. O'Brien, like anybody, lived a life where there were probably things he regretted and things that he wanted to be redeemed for. We all have those things. And so I think that's certainly a theme there. And it can get pretty clear, Maturin saving pairs of children, O'Brien leaving children behind.
Yeah.
So again, he's playing his life out there. And I don't want to be a spoiler. So, again, the abrupt deaths may reflect a death that he's experiencing, in his own life.
Right.
And, I can picture O'Brien sitting down every day, and he's got life going on. He's got this historical world he's living in. Yeah. He's got real life. And those two mix. I think one of the things that comes up later is, how's he going to end this series? Everybody wanted to know, how does he bring this to a close?
Right.
And the answer was, he was never going to bring it to a close. He was living it.
Yeah.
So as long as he was, breathing, those books were going to be breathing.
Yeah.
And so we end up with an incomplete final novel. More power to him. That was what he was doing. Does life really have a clean, wrap up to it? No, not really. We all exit probably, in whatever way. Yeah. So that's what we get.
Not Life, not The Sopranos, not George R.R. Martin. None of these things.
Right. Yeah.
Wow. Tell us a bit about the difference in perspective, because we're now 20 years on from when you wrote and encountered the initial kind of surprises of the discoveries, and then there were various responses to it. How do you feel about the experience now versus how you felt, I don't know, in the early 2000s, just after the book came out?
I don't think it's changed a lot for me. I guess at the time that the book came out, O'Brien had just died.
Yeah.
And I had always hoped that O'Brien, it was kind of a pipe dream while I was writing it, that O'Brien would read the biography and go, hey, you know what? Cat's out of the bag. Let me go talk to my granddaughters. If one great thing could have come out of this, it would have been that he had talked to his granddaughters.
Yeah.
And just said, who cares, that I live this sort of other life. This is no crime, let's just go ahead and admit it. And I think that would have been a great period. Unfortunately, we didn't get that.
Yeah.
Remarkably, Neil Conan, who was the host of Talk of the Nation for NPR, was doing an obituary of O'Brien and had scheduled 6 months in advance of his death, had scheduled an interview with me, which turned out to be the day he died.
Oh my gosh.
Oh, wow.
And so Conan picked up the phone and called me. O'Brien had died actually that night before in Dublin.
Yep.
And Ben Fenton had called me from the Daily Telegraph and said, Dean, we're getting ready to break the news here in London. And I wanted to tell you so you could break the news in the United States. You sort of earned that.
Yeah.
Right. So Neil Conan calls me up and I said, Neil, you're not going to believe this, but I just got a call from the Daily Telegraph telling me that O'Brien had, died last night in Dublin. And Neil's like, I'll call you back, and hangs up. And so he calls all his sources in Dublin and then calls me back and said, you're right. And so then we talked about all his whole life and that piece came out, and ABC World News Tonight with Peter Jennings was in my office a couple hours later.
Wow.
So there was this strange little 15 minutes of fame. My neighbor was cooking dinner, watching the news, and she's like, calls me and she's, you're on the, ABC World News Tonight. It was like very, very, very weird. And so I guess there was a, the Daily Telegraph published it in four, excerpted it in 4 pages. And I was getting lots of mail. I got a mail from a woman who had known him at a certain period in his life in Italy, and actually added another 1,000 words to the UK edition of the book, which would end up in both paperbacks. And so it was still alive for me, and I don't think any of my books are always still alive for me. Even 20 years later, I lived the book. I put in there what I could. I did the best I could at the time, but I'm still thinking, gosh, maybe I'll go to his house now. Or maybe when you sent me, a connection to some of the war records are opening up, I'm like, maybe I'll dig into that again. Cause it's an open book, so to speak, still. And I spend 3 or 4, even 5 years on some of these books, and then still get mail from people, who are reading them, and so it remains part of my life. That whole process.
Right.
I don't think I think the perspective is still similar. I think I had it then, which is I'm a conduit to tell you his life and to make as many connections as I can, and to create a story that's enjoyable and meaningful and valuable in the reading of his books, and hopefully to be a building block in other scholarship that will be done as time passes and more records are available. So I again hope that people will come to these books, and that they will use the companion books in the biography to enhance their readings and their understanding and appreciation of them.
Yeah, we hope so too.
Yeah. You've written a lot of pitches. And I was interested in your take on 2 of them. One to a new reader. Yeah, why should you read the books? One to whoever might make this series one day in TV production.
Well, I think these, Richard Snow said it perfectly: the best historical novels ever written. And we can start right there. And then I think I'd follow up with another comment that these are the most profound writing about male friendship ever written. Now that's pretty powerful, right? Or whether you're a man or a woman, it's pretty interesting to look at this bond that's there. And it's so rich, and it's so amazing, and it works into the plots. It's seamlessly intertwined there, the insights in the plots. So I think, again, they're going to translate into these cinematic moments, and you can think of them when Captain Aubrey is in the stocks and his men are there protecting him. Oh my gosh, I'm getting goosebumps right now. The hair on my skin is rising.
Right.
There's scenes in there that just move us so profoundly and are so cinematic that some filmmaker or series maker is going to create a really powerful series based on these books. That is the reason that you might want to consider delving into them and doing this. And I think it's pretty endless. There's so many plot lines through these books that you could carve your ways through them. You could do 80 episodes ultimately once you got the thing up and rolling, and got great actors creating this relationship. I mean, just sitting with Jack and Stephen in the gun room when they're playing their music and eating toasted cheese, and the characters that are going to pass through, it doesn't have to be big plot points.
Yeah.
They're just marvelous moments, powerful moments that speak to our humanity, our sense of humor, all kinds of things, of the complexity of life. And that's what I think, when we talk about O'Brien's sometimes tough life and difficulties, if he hadn't experienced those, would he be able to write so powerfully about the lives of these 2 guys and the conflicts they have? Another amazing moment is Stephen Matron, who lives on the lower deck and is with the lower deck men who are threatening to mutiny and rolling shot across that deck. And Stephen is playing music with the captain, but can't tell him. Yeah. He won't betray the men who he lives with. The conflict there is just, as a reader, you're just, tell him, but he can't do it because he has this loyalty, and he knows if he betrays those men of the lower deck, he will never get their trust back.
Yeah.
So these moments that O'Brien creates are so fraught and so cinematic that I think filmmakers and are at some point, I think the impediment is the expense it takes to potentially, create the ship and
Create the world.
create that world
Right,
again.
right.
And so, but I think the payoff is going to be there. It's, at some point. And I hope it's in my lifetime.
Yeah, me too. Me too.
Right. Now, how about for a new reader? Would you pitch that differently?
I think, again, best historical novels I've ever written, most profound writing about male friendship, an experience you'll never forget. They'll change. These books are going to change your life.
Yeah.
You're going to appreciate history in a way. You're going to appreciate the world. Your curiosity for the world is going to open up and multiply. And nobody's the same after they've read this series.
True.
And you will make friends, by reading this series, because you will immediately connect with them through this shared experience. And it's powerful, and they'll understand that you have insights into people and the human experience. If that's kind of a grandiose term, but I don't know how else exactly to say it, that you share, and you'll instantly connect. So I think there are many reasons you're going to laugh a lot, and well, I can go back to when I was reading the books. My wife and I like to read in bed before we go to sleep, and I would be lying there laughing, and it would be irritating. She'd be like, "Can you shut up? I'm trying to read," and I'm howling at these books. And I finally said, "Look, if you'll just read one of them, I'll do my best to suppress my laughter." And sure enough, she read the first book and couldn't put them down.
Excellent.
Good. So she and I had the shared experience, which was really great.
Yeah. And I think that's the one thing I would add to both pitches, is to say, we're going back and doing series about history and showing women's roles. And some people saying, perhaps tweaking that a little bit. But I would add that these books, for new readers or for the series, you talk about incredible women exercising agency for themselves in very different ways. A Sophie, a Diana, in that world, and kind of about that, the human condition, and the relationship between these two friends and between them and women. And, it's just so powerful. And I think we miss that. It's not what we're looking for in ships and cannons and history like that. And it's I agree with you. That's why I think Mary plays a big part
in that world of Jane Austen. Right. So I always tell women, you're going to read Master and Commander first, and it's male oriented. But he realized after writing it, that was the first one he wrote. He'd been asked by a Philadelphia publisher of all places to write a book, a naval book. And after he wrote it, he realized he loved it and that it was powerful, and he wanted to write another. And so in the second book, he takes you into Southern England, brings in all the female characters. I sometimes recommend, look, if you don't want to read the first one, just start with the second one and then go back and read the first one if you want to get those female characters. I understand that's important,
right?
But there are very strong women characters here, and there's a lot to be realized for women as well.
Right.
Dean, this has been fantastic. Let's get into your current work, Dean. We've talked about O'Brien writing fiction based on lots of historical truth. It seems to me that you seem to be relishing telling stories, again, based on real life, but non-fiction stories. Tell us what you've been working on lately and some of the other things that we can find with your name on it on the bookshelves.
Yeah, I think my time researching and spending with the Aubrey Maturin books opened my eyes to the relationship more of, I've always loved history, but the relationship between history and literature, and the fine line, O'Brien leaps off of history into fiction. I'm a nonfiction writer, but I realized, I can use a lot of fictional techniques to make history more interesting. So that's kind of been my mission in writing nonfiction books, is to create page-turning experience for the reader where they learn. I learned so much from the Aubrey Maturin novels about history. So why not make history books that you can also have a fun time in and race through the plots? But really, my responsibility in writing nonfiction is really to adhere to the real history. But you can use cliffhanger techniques at the end of chapters and learn how to pace the information you're feeding to the reader so that it's enjoyable. And fortunately, during my research of O'Brien, I found Captain Riley's narrative of shipwreck on the west coast of Africa in 1815 and journeying across Africa as slaves, and in a memoir that made a big impact on Abraham Lincoln, this amazing piece of history. So I was able to leap off of O'Brien into writing this story and going and crossing the Sahara, really going to the places and getting the original material to make these stories come alive. So I did that, and then I eventually wrote a history of the Long March across China, because here in Skeletons, you have men in a survival situation crossing the desert. Yeah. It's hard to find a story where women are doing that. But on the Long March across China in 1934, they get across 4,000 miles, and you have these 30 women with an army of 86,000 men, and they bond. And how do they? What are some of the characteristics of their survival of this really difficult journey? And then once I researched in China doing that, I flowed into the Hatfield McCoy story, which is sort of the quintessential American blood feud. And I have West Virginia roots, so that was really coming home to me. And then followed up that with the story of John Muir and the creation of the modern environmental movement, his love of nature, and a relationship with his editor, a magazine editor at Century Magazine, who took his philosophical writing about nature and said, look, Muir, you write me 2 articles, I'm going to publish them in Century Magazine, then I'm going to go get a bill passed in Washington, D.C. We're going to create Yosemite National Park. And so that fundamental relationship of an editor and writer taking this beautiful writing about nature and philosophy and then translating it into concrete action that changed our world really was powerful to me. I went over to Scotland, to Muir's from Dunbar, Scotland, and researched there, and then lived in that world for a while. So that's been the most recent book. I'm thinking about going back to the maritime naval historical world, based on some of the research I did for Every Man Will Do His Duty, the firsthand accounts that O'Brien used to tell his stories. There are certain accounts in there I'm like, boy, I really would like to bring that back to life. Captain Porter's voyage, first U.S. naval warship into the Pacific, that was influential on O'Brien's, a very rich story, for example. And I've just enjoyed bringing these important, I think, nonfiction stories, new perspectives on them. I'm always amazed when I go back into the history, how many ways there are to reinterpret and retell stories there. I encourage writers always, if there's a period of history that fascinates you, that you want to bring back to life, you're going to find sources. Yeah. Some periods of history there aren't sources, but a lot of them, there's a lot of history left on on the table. It's been interpreted in a certain way, but you can bring new perspectives to it. So that's what I've tried to do with my historical books, and it's been very fulfilling. I continue to learn. I think that's the joy that O'Brien brought to me, was enjoying the reading experience, but also just learning. And I think all O'Brien readers, all Aubrey Maturin readers, really cherish what they learn about the world there and how it opens your mind up. And in the writing of the books, that's what I've had the pleasure of doing. And I hope I can in some way bring that to the reader as well. Learning about a whole new world, being transported to the place. I think it's important that, and again, O'Brien does the same thing. He transports you to another world. And in these historical books that I'm writing, I like to transport people. That's kind of why I got into writing, as a kid, escaping into books. Yeah. I did not have a difficult life. I had a very good life, but I also cherished being able to escape into books. And I never liked it when the writer jarred me out of that world. Like, you take me there, keep me there. And so I think O'Brien does an amazing job of that. When I write history, I don't insert myself. I try to sweep you away back into the time and bring that alive and allow you to live with whatever character I'm writing about. And I think that's where we can then relate with them. If it's a character that's on a pedestal, we can't really relate with them. We can't understand they're human beings, and they had to make decisions that took courage, may or may not have been right or wrong. But if we can go back in there and sort of exist with them for a period, that's when we're going to have insights that will help us with our own lives and understanding, how we relate with the political world we're in.
Great, and there's a lot to figure out.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Dean, you do such a fabulous job doing that too. It's been like you. I spent pretty much every Saturday of my youth riding the bus to the library, bringing back a stack of books, and then spent the week, reading them. And this whole idea that you could somehow go anywhere in time and anywhere in the world and be there. And I found that, but as I grew to adult, I couldn't find as much of that. So, books like yours are just incredible for that. And I really appreciate it.
I really hope the next generation continues reading, because it's a different experience than we get from the computer and from movies and series. And those are all wonderful, but there's a power of reading, particularly I think when you're young, its ability to transport you is it's at another level. So I hope we don't lose that. And I think there are a lot of practitioners, a lot of people who appreciate that and will hopefully continue that tradition.
Yeah. Amen. So, Dean, apart from bringing us Skeletons on the Sahara, apart from the fact that you've brought us Patrick O'Brien, A Life Revealed, and I'm mentioning the names of both of those books in case anybody wants to go look for them.
Right.
I think you might have dropped a hint in our pre-conversation that you've been pitching something fresh and Patrick O'Brien related. Tell us a bit about that before we wrap up.
I originally started out, when I started out to write the biography of Patrick O'Brien, because there wasn't much information and he was not enthusiastic about a biography, I had no idea whether I was going to be able to find enough material. So I pitched the story to my publisher, Henry Holt, as In Search of Patrick O'Brien. Wow. And really that adventure of finding out who he was amazing, and taking a dedication in a short story, going through the records in London or Dublin, and then finding a real live person that I could go find out about a period of O'Brien's life. It was a phenomenal adventure. But as I mentioned, one of my boyhood, I guess, prejudices is I don't like being jarred out of the time. And once I figured out there was enough material about O'Brien to write a biography, I realized it's no longer In Search of Patrick O'Brien. It's his biography. So I didn't want to interrupt that with all my searches, but it's always I've always known that story, that search for who he was, and that delving into that adventure was I thought a powerful story of creativity and perseverance, and what happens when you sort of act on faith and just pursue something, go to Ireland with 2 clues and not knowing what you're going to find, and not really having the right to have a great expectation that you're going to find something. So that's part of the fun of life, right? Is taking a risk and taking a leap. And so ever since I wrote the biography, I've wanted to do In Search of Patrick O'Brien, whether it's a small book about that whole process of finding out who he was, and coming face to face with him in Collioure, but not actually speaking to him, and all kinds of adventures, meeting a woman there who O'Brien wrote about in a novel, not an Aubrey Maturin novel, who we read, a Catalan woman who we read a passage to, and she goes, "C'est moi, c'est moi." And it's a love scene, that he had created in fiction that she didn't know he had written decades earlier. And she realizes he wrote about me, these kinds of things. So I've put together a pitch for a documentary or potentially a fiction series that could be turned on based on the whole search for Patrick O'Brien.
Wow.
And that's being shopped around right now. So if you are a series maker or a streamer or a network, I would love to talk to you.
Excellent. Well, you remember where you heard it first.
Yeah.
We would love to see it made. Right.
You would.
Thank you.
That would be really great. Dean, thanks so much for joining us today. It's been fabulous to go back and talk about the discoveries of your whole process, and I think as well talking about what the quality of the writing and the artistry means alongside what we know about his life. And we've really enjoyed getting into that with you. Thanks very much for the time, and we hope the rest of your summer goes fabulously well.
Thank you. My pleasure. You guys have a great summer as well.
So, Mike, wasn't it great for Dean to be so generous with his time and with his thoughts? I really, really enjoyed the chat that we had with him. I hope all the listeners did too. So, Mike, there's just one thing left. We have one remaining work, the final unfinished voyage of Jack Aubrey. So what do you say, Mike, next week to one last little bit of Patrick O'Brien?
With all my heart.